She lived in a world of quiet vibrations. Her workshop, tucked away in a cobblestone alley that cars seemed to forget, wasn't filled with the loud clang of a blacksmith or the buzz of a power saw. It was a place of whispers. The soft scent of aged wood and lemon oil hung in the air, a perfume she had come to know as home. Her name was Ilara, and her trade was one of patience and perfect pitch. She was a piano tuner, a mender of souls that lived inside wooden boxes. Each morning, she would unlock the heavy, painted green door and step into her sanctuary. Tools were laid out on a clean cloth, each with its own specific purpose. Hammers with faces of different felts, mutes of rubber and wool, and the tuning lever, her personal scepter. She knew these tools not by their names, but by their weight in her hand and the way they felt against her skin. They were extensions of her own fingers, her own ears. For Ilara, a piano wasn't just furniture. It was a complex heart, and she was its cardiologist, listening for the faintest murmur, the slightest arrhythmia in its strings. This quiet life was a fortress she had built brick by brick. It was a safe space, far from the glaring lights and judging eyes of the world. There was a time, a long time ago, when she dreamed of stages. She saw herself in flowing dresses, her fingers dancing across the keys under a single warm spotlight. But that dream had shattered like a dropped wine glass during a recital when she was just 16. She could still remember it with crystal clarity, the way her hands had suddenly felt like clumsy blocks of ice. The single wrong note that rang out in the silent hall like a scream, and the soft, pitying cough from someone in the third row. That sound, that tiny, insignificant cough, had followed her for years, a ghost that haunted every attempt to play for another person. Music, which had been her greatest joy, had become a source of deep, paralyzing fear. So she chose silence. Or rather, she chose the silence of an audience. The conversations she had now were with the instruments themselves, a private dialogue of hammers and strings that no one else could hear, one crisp Tuesday. Her work took her to the Grand Aurelia Hotel. It was a relic from a bygone era, a building that had once sparkled with gold leaf and glittering chandeliers, but was now sleeping under a thick layer of dust and neglect. It had recently been bought, she'd heard, by some big-shot tech tycoon who planned to tear it down or turn it into another glass and steel monstrosity. For now, it stood empty, a grand old lady waiting for her fate. Ilara's job was in the ballroom. She pushed through a pair of heavy, carved doors and stepped into a space that stole her breath. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, poured through tall, arched windows, illuminating a cavernous room. A once great parquet floor was dull and scuffed, and at the far end, standing like a forgotten queen, was a grand piano. Its black lacquer was cloudy, and ivory keys were yellowed with age, but it still held a regal air. This was her patient for the day. She set up her tools, the quiet clink of her case latches echoing in the immense room. The silence was so profound it felt like a presence. She worked slowly, methodically, her world shrinking to the 88 keys and the 220 strings that brought them to life. She would press a key, listen to the note, feel its vibration through the floorboards, and then gently turn the pin with her lever, coaxing the string a fraction of a millimeter higher or lower. Ping, ping, ping. Each perfect note was a small victory, a moment of order in the chaos. She lost all track of time, her focus absolute. The dust, the empty room, the world outside the windows, it all faded away. There was only her and the piano speaking their ancient, resonant language. After what felt like minutes but was actually hours, she was done. The last string was settled, the last dissonance smoothed away. The piano was in tune, its voice clear and pure once more. She usually packed up and left right then, her job complete. But today, something was different. The light had softened to a golden hue, bathing the ballroom in a warm, dreamlike glow. The silence felt less empty now, more peaceful. Her fingers, still resting on the keys, felt a familiar tingle. It was an itch, a deep, old longing to not just fix the music, but to make it. She looked around. The room was vast and empty. The doors were closed. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, a world away. Her heart gave a little flutter of anxiety, the ghost of that teenage fear stirring. Don't, a voice in her head warned. Someone might hear, but who? The building was abandoned. The staff had all gone home. Taking a slow, deep breath, she let her fingers drift. They didn't press down with the force of a performance, but with the gentle curiosity of an explorer. The first note that emerged was soft, hesitant. It hung in the air, a single, clear question. Then another note followed, and another. Soon, her fingers were moving on their own, tracing a path she knew by heart. It was a simple melody, one she had composed in the quiet of her own room many years ago. It wasn't complex or flashy. It was a lonely tune, full of a quiet sort of sadness, but also with a thread of hope running through it like a vein of gold in a rock. It was the sound of her own soul, stripped bare. The notes rose and fell like a gentle tide, filling the dusty ballroom with a story that no one had ever heard. She closed her eyes, her fear melting away, replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of creation. For the first time in over a decade, she was just playing, unseen by her. Near the shadowed entrance of the ballroom, a man stood perfectly still. He had come to the hotel seeking refuge, an escape from the noise and pressure that had become his life. His name was Julian, and the weight of his recent corporate conquests felt less like a victory and more like a boulder on his chest. He had been walking aimlessly through the hollowed-out building when the sound reached him. It was just a few notes at first, but it was enough to make him stop. He followed the sound to the ballroom and stood in the doorway. Hidden by the heavy curtains, the melody that drifted out was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the polished commercial music he was used to. It was raw, honest, and deeply human. It cut through the chaos in his mind, the endless ringing of phones and shouting of voices, and settled something deep inside him. He watched the woman at the piano, her head bent in concentration, her body swaying slightly with the music. He didn't know who she was, but in that moment, she was giving him a gift he didn't even know he needed, a moment of perfect, unshakable peace. He stood there, a silent sentinel, until the last note faded into the sunlit air and the silence returned. He waited a moment longer, then, as quietly as he had arrived, he turned and walked away, the hauntingly beautiful melody now a permanent resident in his memory. The memory of that melody became a secret he carried with him, a small, smooth stone in his pocket that he could touch when the world got too sharp. In the days that followed his visit to the old hotel, the man found himself unconsciously humming its quiet, lonely tune. He would be in the middle of a tense meeting, staring at a projection of soaring profit charts, and the notes would bubble up from his chest, a silent rebellion against the stark numbers and cold facts. It was a whisper from another life, a life he didn't have but suddenly felt he needed. His world was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city. His office, on the top floor of a tower that bore his company's name, was designed to impress and intimidate. The furniture was sharp and angular, the art on the walls was stark and expensive, and the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a god's-eye view of the sprawling metropolis below. From up here, the cars looked like tiny insects and the people were invisible. It was easy to forget the human element when you were this high up, but the melody he'd heard in the dusty ballroom was profoundly human. It was the sound of feet on the ground, of a quiet heart beating in a quiet room. The pressure had been building for months. The recent acquisition of a rival company had been a brutal fight, a war waged in boardrooms and on stock market tickers. He had won, but victory felt hollow. He was now responsible for thousands of new employees, for integrating two massive, clashing corporate cultures, for justifying the staggering cost to his shareholders. The weight of it all was a physical thing, a constant pressure on his shoulders and a tightness in his gut that never seemed to go away. He slept less, ate less, and drank more coffee than was good for him. His days were a blur of back-to-back meetings, his nights a lonely stare at the city lights from his cold, minimalist apartment. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. He was on a conference call with his legal team and a group of senior executives. They were discussing a lawsuit, a messy fallout from the takeover. The voices on the other end of the line were tense, clipped, and full of jargon. Synergistic liabilities, one lawyer said. Repertory indemnities? said another. The words were like sharp little stones being thrown at him. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus, but a strange sensation was creeping over him. It started as a warmth spreading across his chest. Then his heart began to beat, not faster but harder. Thump, thump, thump. Each beat was a heavy, painful blow against his ribs. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs wouldn't cooperate. It felt like there was a band tightening around his chest, squeezing the air out. The voices on the phone began to sound distant and distorted, as if he were underwater. The numbers on the computer screen started to swim. "Sir? Are you still with us?" a voice asked, sounding 1,000,000 miles away. He tried to answer, to say yes, but no sound came out. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The room began to tilt. The edges of his vision started to darken, closing in like a camera shutter. A terrifying thought, clear and absolute, slammed into his mind. This is it. I'm having a heart attack. I'm dying. The fear was overwhelming, a tidal wave of pure panic that washed away all thought, all logic. He wasn't a powerful CEO anymore. He was just a man, trapped in a failing body, utterly alone. He slid out of his chair, his body clumsy and uncooperative. He hit the floor with a dull thud, the phone clattering beside him. He could hear frantic shouts from the receiver and from his assistant, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. He could see her rushing toward him, her face a mask of alarm. But it all felt like a movie he was watching, not something that was happening to him. The roaring in his ears was deafening. The blackness was closing in, and the weight on his chest was crushing. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the end, and then, through the roaring and the terror, a single note sounded in his mind. It was the first note of her melody. It was faint at first, almost lost in the storm of his panic. But it was there, a clear, pure C-sharp that hung in the darkness of his mind. He clung to it like a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage. He didn't know where it came from, but he didn't question it. He just held on. Another note followed, then another. Slowly, hesitantly, the melody began to rebuild itself in his memory. He focused all his energy on it, on the simple, heartbreaking rise and fall of the tune. He tried to match his breathing to its rhythm. A slow, shaky inhale as the melody climbed, a long, ragged exhale as it fell. In and out. The roaring in his ears began to soften, replaced by the phantom music. The crushing weight on his chest seemed to lessen with each phantom note he could recall. He was no longer in his sleek, glass office. In his mind, he was back in that sunlit, dusty ballroom. He could see the golden light, could smell the old wood and the lemon oil. He could see the woman, her head bent over the keys, lost in her own world. The memory was so real, so vivid, that it became more real than the panic. The fear was still there, a cold presence in the background, but it was no longer in control. The melody was in control. It was an anchor in the churning sea of his fear, holding him steady. By the time his assistant knelt beside him, her hand trembling on his arm, and the paramedics burst into the room with their loud bags and urgent voices, the worst had passed. The blackness at the edges of his vision had receded. He could see the worried faces looking down at him. He could feel the cool, hard floor beneath his back. He was still shaky, his body drenched in sweat and his heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm, but he was alive. He was breathing. Later, in the quiet of a hospital room, a doctor confirmed what he already suspected on some level. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a severe panic attack brought on by extreme stress and burnout. The doctor spoke about lifestyle changes, about therapy and medication, about taking a vacation. The man nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He knew the doctor was right, but he also knew they were missing the most important piece of the puzzle, lying there in the sterile white bed. Hooked up to monitors that now showed a steady heartbeat, he replayed the event in his mind. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the doctor's advice wouldn't be enough. He could take all the vacations in the world, but the pressure would still be there when he returned. He could talk to a therapist, but they couldn't give him what he truly needed because he knew what had saved him. It wasn't the paramedics or the doctor or his own willpower. It was a forgotten melody played by a lonely woman in an empty room. That simple, pure sound had pulled him back from the brink. It had been a lifeline thrown into a dark and terrifying abyss. And as he stared out the window at the city lights, a new, all-consuming purpose began to form in his mind. He had to find her. He had to find the woman who played the music that saved his life. It was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of survival. The hospital room was white and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm that had raged inside him just hours before. Monitors beeped softly beside his bed, displaying a steady, reassuring heartbeat. A doctor had come and gone, talking about stress and adrenaline, prescribing rest and therapy. The man listened, but the words were like distant echoes. His mind was somewhere else entirely. It was back in that sun-dusted ballroom, replaying a melody he couldn't forget. The notes were no longer just a memory. They were a part of him now, etched into his soul. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that that simple, lonely tune was the only thing that had pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't just a pleasant sound. It was a remedy, a lifeline. The moment he was released, the search began. He was a man who built empires, who moved markets with a single decision. Finding one woman should be easy, he thought. But he quickly discovered that his usual methods were useless in this new, unfamiliar world. He drove back to the Grand Aurelia Hotel, his expensive car looking out of place in the forgotten neighborhood. He pushed through the heavy doors of the ballroom, but the magic was gone. The sunlight seemed harsher, the dust just looked like dirt. The piano stood silent, a beautiful but empty object. He questioned the few construction workers on site, but they just shrugged. They were there to demolish and rebuild, not to keep track of every person who wandered through. Frustration began to bubble inside him. He felt like he was trying to catch smoke. Back in his glass tower, he tried to explain the situation to his assistants. He found himself humming the tune, a clumsy, off-key imitation of the pure notes he remembered. "It goes like this," he'd say, humming a few bars. "And then it sort of falls. It's sad, but not too sad." They would nod politely, their faces blank, trying to hide their confusion. To them, he was the brilliant, intimidating CEO, and this sudden obsession with a forgotten song must have seemed like a symptom of his breakdown. He could see it in their eyes. They thought he was losing it. This made him even more determined. He wasn't crazy. What he had experienced was real. He realized he had to stop thinking like a man, haunted by a memory, and start thinking like a CEO solving a problem. He called his head of security, a no-nonsense man who could find anyone, anywhere. "I need you to find someone," he said, his voice steady and firm. "A woman?" She was at the old Aurelia Hotel last Tuesday. She was tuning the piano in the ballroom. He gave the description he could remember, quiet, focused, probably unassuming. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a company. He only had a time and a place. His team got to work. They'd pulled security footage, but as he suspected, the cameras in that part of the hotel had been offline for years. They checked city work permits, but the piano tuning had been arranged informally, cash in hand to save the new owners a bit of money. It was a dead end. The trail was cold. For days, there was nothing. The man felt the old familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach again. What if he never found her? What if that one, perfect melody was the only he would ever hear? Then his security chief had an idea. "Sir," he said one morning, standing before his desk, "we can't find the woman, but we can find the piano. It's a specific make and model. We can track its service history." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The trail led them through a series of records to a small, family-owned business that specialized in restoring and servicing high-end instruments. The company was old-fashioned, built on a foundation of trust and discretion. When his legal team contacted them, they hit a wall. Client confidentiality was their cornerstone. They refused to give up the name of the tuner who had worked on the piano. The man felt a flash of his old impatience, the urge to use his power to crush this small obstacle. But he stopped himself. That wasn't the way. This wasn't a corporate takeover. This was personal. So he changed his strategy. Instead of a threat, he made an offer. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. An exclusive multi-year contract to service every single piano in every hotel, office, and lobby he owned, including the newly renovated Grand Aurelia, for a sum that would secure their company for generations. The only condition was the name of the tuner from the ballroom. A day later, he had it. The name felt strange on his tongue. It was simple, elegant, just like the melody she played. Armed with a name and an address, he drove to the part of the city where towers of glass gave way to streets of brick. He found the workshop tucked away in a quiet alley, the sign above the door so faded it was almost unreadable. He parked his car and stood for a moment, feeling like an intruder. This was her world, not his. The air smelled of old wood, varnish, and something else. Something like peace. He pushed open the door and a small bell chimed softly. Inside, the space was small and cluttered, but in a comfortable, organized way. Tools hung on the walls, and several pianos in various states of disrepair stood like sleeping giants. And there she was. She was standing with her back to him, bent over the exposed guts of an upright piano, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle grace. She was wearing a simple work apron over her clothes, and her hair was tied up in a messy bun. She looked exactly as he had pictured her, completely absorbed in her work, a quiet artist in her private studio. She must have heard the bell, because she straightened up and turned around. Her eyes, when they met his, were wary and guarded, like a wild animal that had been startled. She wasn't used to visitors, especially not visitors in tailored suits. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He felt a sudden wave of nervousness, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He knew that if he came at her with his title and his power, she would shut down completely. He had to speak her language. He took a step forward, away from the door, and into her world. "I hope so," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't mention the hotel or his company. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He hummed. He hummed the first few bars of the melody. It was clumsy and imperfect, but it was enough. The change in her was immediate and visible. The color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been resting on the piano behind her, clenched into fists. Her whole body went tense. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice sharp, a wall slamming down between them. "You must have the wrong person." He expected this. He didn't push. He just stood there, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "My name is Julian," he said, finally offering his name. "I was at the Grand Aurelia Hotel last Tuesday. I heard you play." "I don't play for people," she said, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You need to leave." "I'm not here to cause you trouble," he said gently. "I'm here because I need to thank you." He took a deep breath, deciding to just tell her the truth, no matter how strange it sounded. "A week after I heard you, I was in my office. I had a medical emergency. A very bad panic attack. I thought I was dying." He watched her face, saw the flicker of confusion in her guarded eyes. "And in the middle of it, when everything was falling apart, your melody came into my head. It was the only thing I could hold on to. It was the only thing that got me through it." He paused, letting his words sink in. He looked her directly in the eye, his expression completely open and vulnerable. "You didn't just play a song that day," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You threw me a lifeline." Ilara stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The wall she had so carefully built around herself for over a decade had a huge crack running right down the middle. This man, a stranger from a world she couldn't imagine, was telling her that her most secret, most shameful, most private thing, her music, had saved his life. It was a concept so foreign, so overwhelming, that she couldn't process it. All she could do was stand there in the quiet of her workshop and stare at the man whose life she had unknowingly changed. The silence in the small workshop was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Ilara just stared at him, her mind a complete blank. His words echoed in the quiet space, each one a strange, impossible pebble dropped into the still pond of her life. A lifeline, The phrase felt too big, too important for anything she had ever done. Her music was her secret, her shame, her private prison. It couldn't be someone else's salvation. It just couldn't. "You must be mistaken," she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She looked away from his intense gaze, focusing instead on a chipped coffee mug on her workbench. "It was just a tune. Nothing special." "It was everything," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. He took a small step closer, then seemed to think better of it and stopped, keeping a respectful distance. "I know how this sounds. A stranger shows up in your workshop telling you a crazy story. But I'm not crazy. And what I'm telling you is the truth." He paused, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look surprisingly vulnerable. Less like the powerful CEO she imagined him to be and more like a man who was simply lost. "I don't expect you to understand. I needed you to know. And I needed to see you, to see the person who helped me." Ilara felt a confusing swirl of emotions. There was fear, of course, the old familiar companion that had been with her for years. But there was something else, too. A flicker of curiosity. This man didn't look like he was there to mock her. He looked genuinely humbled. It was an expression she had never seen on a person before, not in relation to her music. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the suspicion creeping back into her voice. This had to be a trick, a setup. Maybe he was a music critic or a talent scout, and this was some elaborate, cruel prank. He seemed to understand her fear. "I'm not going to ask you to perform for me," he said quickly. "I would never do that. I promise." He took a deep breath, as if what he was about to say next was difficult for him. "I have a request, but it's not what you think." He waited, watching her, giving her space to process. She didn't say anything, just wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture she knew well. "In my office," he began slowly, "on the top floor of my company's building, there is a grand piano. A beautiful one. It's mostly for decoration. No one ever plays it." He looked her directly in the eye. "I want you to teach me. I want you to teach me how to play that melody." The request was so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that it caught her completely off guard. She had been bracing for a demand, for an order, for some kind of ultimatum. But not this. "Not this quiet, humble plea, teach you?" she repeated, the words sounding foreign even to her own ears. "Yes," he said. "You don't have to play for anyone? You don't even have to play for me, not really. Just show me. Show me how to make those sounds. It's important to me. It's a personal project." Ilara's mind raced. The thought of going to his world, to that gleaming tower high above the city, was terrifying. The thought of touching a piano in front of another person, even if it was just to guide their hands, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. But the alternative was to send him away, to close the door and go back to her quiet, safe life. But now that life felt different. The memory of his words, "You threw me a lifeline," had changed something. For the first time, her music wasn't just a source of fear. It was something else. Something valuable. She looked at his face, at the earnestness in his eyes. He wasn't asking her to be a performer. He was asking her to be a teacher. It was a completely different role. It wasn't about her. It was about him. It was about passing on the knowledge, not showing off the skill. Slowly, hesitantly, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she breathed out, the word barely audible. "I'll try." That's how their unlikely lessons began. Every Tuesday afternoon, Ilara would leave her dusty workshop and take a taxi to a part of the city she had only ever seen from a distance. The building where he worked was a monolith of glass and steel, so tall it seemed to scrape the clouds. The lobby was vast and echoing, filled with people in sharp suits walking with purpose. She felt small and out of place in her simple coat and worn boots. Clutching her small bag of tools as if it were a shield, he would always meet her personally at the elevator. A quiet presence in the rushing river of his employees. He'd lead her to the top floor, to his office. The first time she stepped inside, she felt her breath catch. The room was huge. The entire back wall was a window, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city. It felt like being on top of the world. And in the middle of this cold, impressive space sat the grand piano, its black lacquer gleaming under the recessed lights. The first lesson was awkward. He, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, was clumsy and impatient with the ivory keys. His fingers, used to tapping on keyboards and signing documents, felt stiff and useless. He would press a key too hard, producing a jarring, ugly sound, and let out a frustrated sigh. "No," she would say softly, her voice quiet but firm. "Don't hit it. Caress it. Feel the weight of the key before you press it down." She would stand behind him, her presence a calming influence. At first, she was too nervous to touch him, instead just pointing with her finger. "Your wrist is too high. Loosen up. Let your arm be a part of it." Slowly, week by week, a rhythm developed. The awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a comfortable routine. As they worked on the melody, note by painful note, they began to talk. He told her about the immense pressure of his job, the loneliness of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He spoke of the expectation to always be strong, always have the answer, a mask that had become so heavy he could barely breathe underneath it. In turn, she found herself opening up in a way she never had with anyone. She told him about her father, a passionate but struggling musician who had taught her to love the piano as a private joy, not a public spectacle. She told him about the recital, the memory of which was still so sharp it could make her flinch. She described the feeling of all those eyes on her, the sudden paralysis of her hands, the single, wrong note that had felt like a public condemnation. "You see," she said one afternoon, her gaze fixed on his hands on the keys, "for me, the piano became a place of failure. It was the place where I wasn't good enough." He listened to her, really listened, in a way no one ever had. He didn't offer easy solutions or empty platitudes. He just nodded, his expression full of empathy. "I understand that feeling," he said. "Maybe not with music, but with failure? The fear that one wrong move will bring everything crashing down." The breakthrough came during their fourth lesson. He was struggling with a particular chord transition, his fingers fumbling and refusing to cooperate. He let out a groan of frustration, pulling his hands away. "I can't do it. My hands are too stupid." Without thinking, Ilara moved closer. "No, they're not. You're just thinking too hard." She reached out and gently placed her hands over his, guiding them back to the keys. "Relax," she whispered. "Feel it with me." Her hands were small and cool on his. For a moment they both froze. It was the first time they had touched. The air in the vast office seemed to crackle with a new, unspoken energy. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor in his fingers. He could feel the gentle pressure of her touch, the certainty in her guidance. She slowly moved his fingers into the correct position, her hands resting lightly on his. "Together now," she said softly. Together, they pressed the keys. The chord rang out, clear and perfect. And in that moment, something shifted inside Ilara. The fear was still there. A faint hum in the background, but it was overshadowed by something else. A flicker of the old joy. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for an audience. It was a shared act of creation. It was her and him and the music, all in the same breath. She wasn't just playing for someone. She was playing with them. And for the first time in over a decade, the piano felt like a home again, not a prison. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. The lessons in his penthouse office became a ritual, a small island of peace in the vast ocean of his corporate life. He found himself looking forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation that felt foreign and wonderful. The frantic energy that had once defined him began to soften, replaced by a calmer, more focused demeanor. His assistants noticed it. The sharp edges of his temper seemed to have been smoothed away. He was still the boss, still decisive and in command, but there was a new humanity to his leadership. He started asking people how they were, and he actually waited to hear the answer. For Ilara, the change was just as profound. The workshop was still her sanctuary, but it no longer felt like a fortress. The walls she had built around herself were still there, but they were lower now, with windows cut into them. She found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done in years. The simple act of sharing her music, even in this small, controlled way, had begun to heal a part of her she thought was broken forever. She was teaching him, but in a way he was teaching her too. He was teaching her that her music didn't have to be perfect to be valuable. It just had to be honest. One afternoon, as he was finally able to play the melody from start to finish without a single mistake, he put his hands in his lap and turned to her. "The hotel is ready," he said, his voice quiet. "The Grand Aurelia. We're having a big press conference and gala to celebrate the reopening. It's next Friday." Ilara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. "That's nice," she said, her eyes drifting back to the piano keys. "I want you to be there," he said, and her head snapped up. "I want you to play." The fear hit her like a physical blow. All the old panic came rushing back. The thought of all those people, the bright lights, the judging eyes. It was too much. "No," she said immediately, shaking her head. "I can't. I told you, I don't play for people." "I know," he said, his voice gentle and understanding. He didn't push. He just leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But this would be different. It wouldn't be a performance. It would be a story. Our story. I'm going to give a speech about the hotel, about its history and its future. And I want to tell them the truth. I want to tell them that the real heart of this building isn't the marble floors or the crystal chandeliers. It's a melody. It's your melody." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "You don't have to be a concert pianist, Ilara. You just have to be you. The person who played that tune in an empty room and saved a man's life. People need to hear that. They need to know that art doesn't have to be big and loud to change things. Sometimes the quietest sounds are the most powerful." She was silent for a long time, her mind a battlefield of fear and a strange, new feeling, a sense of purpose. He wasn't asking her to do this for fame or for money. He was asking her to do it because it mattered. Because her music mattered. She looked at his face, at the sincerity and the hope she saw there. He had shown her such vulnerability, such trust. Could she not do the same for him? "I'll be scared," she whispered, admitting it out loud for the first time. "I'll be right there," he promised. "In the front row. The whole time. You just have to look at me. Forget everyone else." She took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. It was the hardest and the easiest decision she had ever made. The night of the gala of the Grand Aurelia was transformed. The dusty ballroom was now a vision of elegance, the scuffed floors polished to a high gloss, the chandeliers sparkling with light. A sea of well-dressed people mingled, their voices a low, excited hum. Backstage, in a small, curtained-off area, Ilara felt like she was going to be sick. Her hands were cold and clammy, and her heart was beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She peeked through a gap in the curtain and saw the crowd, 100 times bigger and more intimidating than the handful of people at her teenage recital. Just as she was about to turn and run, he appeared. He wasn't in his CEO suit. He was wearing a simple jacket and trousers. He looked like just another guest. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, unable to speak. He didn't try to tell her she'd be fine. He just stood with her for a moment, a solid, calming presence. "Remember what I said?" he murmured. "Just look at me. Find my face. It'll just be you and me and the piano in that room again?" "Okay." She nodded, taking a deep breath and trying to anchor herself in his words. Soon, his name was announced, and he walked out onto the stage to a round of applause. Ilara watched from the wings as he stood at the podium. He spoke about the hotel's history, its architecture, and his vision for its future. He was confident, charming, and commanding. Then his tone shifted. "But a building is more than just steel and stone," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. "Its true value lies in its soul. And a few months ago, in this very room, I discovered the soul of the Grand Aurelia." He went on to tell the story, not as a powerful CEO, but as a broken man. He spoke of the stress, the panic attack, and the moment he thought his life was over. He didn't use dramatic language. He just told the simple, honest truth. Then he told them about the melody and the woman who played it. When he finished, there was a profound silence in the room. "And now," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "it is my great honor to introduce you to the heart of the Grand Aurelia, Ms. Ilara Vance." He walked off the stage and went directly to the front row, taking his seat. He looked at her and gave a small, encouraging nod. It was time. Ilara walked out onto the stage, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The lights were blinding, and the crowd was a dark, faceless mass. She could feel the old panic rising, the familiar tightening in her chest. She sat down at the grand piano, its polished wood gleaming under the lights. Her hands hovered over the keys. Trembling, she looked up and scanned the crowd, her vision blurry. Then she found him. He was right where he said he'd be, in the front row. He wasn't looking at his phone or talking to anyone. He was looking right at her, his expression full of a quiet, unwavering faith. She took a deep breath, just as she had done 100 times in his office. She focused on his face, and the rest of the world began to fade away. She let her fingers fall onto the keys. The first note rang out, clear and pure. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight tremor in her hand that gave it a human fragility. But it was honest. As she continued to play, the trembling stopped. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it receded, pushed to the back of her mind by the music. She was no longer on a stage in front of hundreds of people. She was back in that sunlit, dusty room playing for herself. But this time she wasn't alone. She was sharing her soul, and in doing so, she was setting it free. The melody rose and fell, filling the grand ballroom with its simple, heartbreaking beauty. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then a single person began to clap. It was him. He stood up, his applause the only sound in the room. Then another person joined in, and another, until the entire room was on its feet, the applause a thundering wave of sound that washed over her. She stood up and turned to face the audience. Her face wet with tears she hadn't realized were falling. It wasn't fame she felt in that moment. It was release. It was freedom. The story didn't end there with a record deal or a world tour. The true ending was quieter. It happened a few weeks later, in her small workshop. The bell above the door chimed, and he walked in, a small, hopeful smile on his face. He went over to the old upright piano she was repairing and sat down on the bench. "I've been trying to write a new tune," he said, a little sheepishly. He fumbled with the keys for a moment, playing a few simple, hesitant notes. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was just a simple, honest sound. Ilara watched him for a moment, a real, unguarded laugh escaping her lips. She walked over and sat down on the bench beside him. "You're holding your wrist too high," she said softly. She reached over and placed her hands on his, guiding them. "Relax," she whispered. "Feel it with me." Together they added a few more notes to the melody. It was their song now. A new song written just for them in the quiet sanctuary of her workshop, far from any stage or spotlight. And it was the most beautiful music she had ever heard.